Hello, Paul, and welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Hello. Right, Paul Morland. I saw an interview you did on another podcast. I've read a couple of articles that you've written on demographic decline, population decline, and I thought I'd discuss it with you in more detail. Before we get into it, can you just explain who you are and how did you get to this point to be an expert in like demographic decline?
My name is Paul Morland. I am a pretty much full-time demographer now. I was working as a business consultant for many years, and while I was doing that, I did my PhD at Birkbeck with Eric Kaufman, and I wrote a thesis on how groups in conflict, in ethnic conflict particularly, use demography as part of their strategy. So why does demography matter in ethnic conflict? And then what approaches have people taken in ethnic conflict to use demography in their interests? And that was my PhD thesis. I got my PhD in 2012, I think, and then published that my thesis as a book, an academic book called Demographic Engineering, Population Strategies and Ethnic Conflict, which came out in 2014. At the time, I thought there was probably a market for a more popular book, not something for the academic market, but something for the general reader on how demography more generally had driven some of the great events of history, and how you can't really understand history unless you understand the demographic transition that started in the British Isles at the end of the 18th century and went global, meaning population rises and relative falls in different places at different times. And that was The Human Tide, which came out in 2019, which I'm pleased to say has been translated into about 9 languages, I think. Then I thought, well, if demography's driven the past, it must be driving the present and the future. And I wrote Tomorrow's People, which is really a sort of audit of where we are today globally in demographic terms: what's up, what's down, what's growing, what's shrinking, what's moving. And that was published in 2022. And then that's also had a few 3 or 4 foreign language translations. I'm now just finishing up my next book, my 4th book, which is called No One Left: Why the World Needs More Children. That will be published in July this year. And meanwhile, I do podcasts, and I did a TEDx talk. I've written articles for various places, newspapers, the Telegraph, the FT, the Sunday Times. And I have written a long article with an economist called Philip Pilkington on the demographic trilemma, which we may come on to talk about. And Philip Pilkington and I are now working on another article for Policy Exchange, the think tank, on what I call at the moment, I think this would probably be the title of the essay, Small Families or Small State. The idea being you can't have both, that if you want to have a smaller state, less welfare, lower taxes, you have to change the demography. So hopefully that gives you some idea of who I am and what I've done.
So if we go back to historically, especially over the last, if we say since the start of the 20th century, just in brief terms, how has the world population changed? And obviously we're going to talk about population decline, but where was that point over the last, well, since the start of the 20th century? Where was that point where it started to decline and become a real concern?
Well, if you don't mind, I'll start at about 1800. That's a convenient starting point. And I think all you need to know up to there very broadly is that in the days of Julius Caesar, there were 250 million people on the planet, or maybe a third. We don't know exactly. By the time of Queen Victoria, there were 1 billion. So the world population had quadrupled. Or tripled, maybe. That sounds like a lot. But actually, over 2,000 years, it's very slow growth. And the reason it was slow growth is that the capacity of the planet was quite limited, and that you couldn't have had, if every couple has 6 kids, which they would have more or less if without contraception over the course of a normal woman's fertility period, every generation would be 3 times the size of the last 2 people would make 6 people. Now, if you do the maths and you assume that a generation is 25 years, you triple, and triple again in a century, the world's population would be going off the scale. And that didn't happen because of the constraints that Thomas Malthus spoke about. If war or disease didn't get you, then famine would. The world could not support hundreds of billions of people, which it would have given rise to. So there was a lot of birth, but a lot of death, and the endless pruning of humanity by particularly infant mortality and lots of people dying before they made it to an age where they could have their own children. So that was where you got to at about 1800, pretty slow growth to then. You got to 1 billion. Now today you have 8 billion. So having taken nearly 2,000 years to go from a maybe triple, maybe quadruple, the population of the world has grown 8-fold since then. What happens is, first of all, you have a drop of mortality. People stop dying in such numbers, particularly children survive. That's because you've got better healthcare, better sanitation, better educated parents are better able to keep their kids alive. And that, first of all, happens in the UK and North America among the English, predominantly at that point, English origin populations of the young United States. And if you're still having 6 or 7 children per woman, but the mortality rate drops, the population explodes. So that's what happened, first of all, in Britain. And then eventually the fertility rates fall. By the First World War, they'd gone from maybe from the 1860s or 1870s from 6 or so per woman down to 3 in the more advanced parts of the Europe. And so that's the demographic transition from high fertility, high mortality, low population to low fertility, low mortality, high population. And then the story of the 20th century really was how that then spread across the rest of the world. And particularly at the latter part of the 20th century, you got those kinds of population explosions in the more advanced parts of the developing world. And today you're seeing them in countries like Nigeria or Chad or Niger, where again, the fertility rate is still very high, as it always has been at 5 or 6, but mortality is coming down because a little bit of development and a little bit of education, a little bit of public health and improved diets means much lower mortality rate. So sub-Saharan Africa is now the place where the population is booming. But even in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, fertility is starting to come down. So in South Africa, it's been 3 for a long time, 3 children per woman, and places like Kenya and Ethiopia being very successful at bringing it down. So we're now in a point where the last high fertility countries are starting to bring their fertility rates down. But what's happening in much of the world, in places where this transition happened early, is that people are having too few children. It didn't settle in at about 2 children per woman, meaning a nice steady state. What it's done is it's fallen to significantly below replacement level, as low as about 2/3 of a child per woman. So 2 people are required to make 2/3 of a person. In Korea, South Korea, that means each cohort's about 1/3 of the last. And that's the great challenge which we're now facing as a human species.
One of the interviews I watched you said there were like 10 factors that could affect this demographic decline. I know one of them was fertility rate. Can you just briefly go through the others as well as to why?
Well, that's the structure of my latest book, the third one, before the next one comes out in July, which was Tomorrow's People, which I structured it around 10 interconnected numbers, which kind of tells you about the demographic transition. So I start with tumbling infant mortality rates, and that's really the big driver in the developing world. Countries like Sierra Leone, which I think probably has the highest infant mortality rate, it's still come down from probably about 1/4, in other words, 1 child in 4 dying before the age of 1, to less than 10% today. And in many countries like Peru, it's tumbled. And that's the big factor in population growth. So that's sort of the first factor. The second factor then is population growth. The example I give, it's happening in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps growing from 7% of the world's population to more than 1/3 between the middle of the 20th century and the end of the 21st. So we're about halfway through that period now, and we are seeing a massive rise in the population of sub-Saharan Africa, which I argue will inevitably change all sorts of things about the world, its economy, its geopolitics, and so on. Then when you get this massive growth of population, the countryside can only absorb so many hands, there's only so much land, and actually the countryside is getting more automated, so it needs fewer hands exactly when the population is booming, and people head for the towns. So the next big thing is urbanization. We passed the point where half the world's population lives in towns about 20 years ago. And it's very significant. People who live in towns are very different from people who live in the countryside in the developing world. Not so much in the developed world. A country liver in Britain or Germany or America is going to be literate, have a high level of education, might choose the country for all sorts of reasons. But in a developing country, it's the towns where people get that education, join the formal economy. And the other thing about people in the towns is that they have a lower fertility rate. And the traditional argument is they're more educated, they've got more access to contraception, the women are more likely to want to pursue careers. And then the other thing is an extra pair of hands is useful in the countryside. A child is easy and cheap to accommodate in your rural accommodation, and it's quickly and easily put to work. In the towns, a child is a drain on resources. You want to invest in your child's education so that 20 years hence he or she can get a decent job. So in the towns, people have smaller families. The example I give is Singapore, where the fertility rate is around 1 child per woman. But in most countries, particularly so again, in Britain or Germany, it doesn't make that much difference. Actually, rural fertility rates are still higher in the US. But in a country like Ethiopia, for example, Addis, the women have 2 children. The rest of the country, on average, 4. Nigeria, Lagos, they have 3 children. The national average is 6. In India, Calcutta, they have 1 child per woman. The national average is 2. So urban people have smaller families. And as the world gets more urban, so overall fertility rates tumble. And that's the next thing is low fertility rates. Now, as fertility rates fall, if you've got longer life expectancy on the one hand, and fewer children on the other hand, then you will get an aging population. And I give the example of Catalonia. I spend a lot of time in French Catalonia. Not a lot of people know that there is such a thing as French Catalonia, but north of the Pyrenees or in the Perpignan area, there is French Catalonia. I went down to spend a bit of time in Spanish Catalonia, and I compare the Catalonia of George Orwell 100 years ago, or perhaps 90 years ago, which was very anarchic. There was a civil war, there was a lot of anarchism and communism. Today it's a very calm, mature place, even though they had an independence referendum, which was won by the separatists, but the authorities in Madrid refused to acknowledge it. There was no violence, and the reason or no real violence, the reason I argue is that the median age is in the mid-40s. Back in Orwell's days, it was in the mid-20s. People in their 20s are more impulsive, they've got less to lose, and they're more likely to plunge a country into civil war. They're also more criminal. So as your median age rises, so also your crime falls, the probability of war falls. And then eventually you get a very large number of old people. So Japan has 70 or 80,000, over 100 centenarians today. Soon we'll have over 100,000, which is a lot of, and it's only going up. And generally you get a very, very old population. Old populations require a lot of healthcare. They require a lot of what we call in the UK social care. In other words, people just to look after them. And they also require pensions. And you get a population in which more and more people are very old, fewer and fewer people are paying taxes, and that gives rise to all sorts of issues. We see Japan, for example, which has the oldest population and relative to its population, the largest number of very old people, also has government debt of 2.5 times the size of Britain's relative to its economy. And I think in Japan, we see our future, the world future, which is a shortage of labor and a real problem in government financing. So then you have an alternative, which is either to live with that, which is difficult, or to have mass immigration, which we've seen in many countries, in Britain, in the United States, for example. And the data I show there is the decline of the self-defining white non-Latino population in the US from perhaps 85% or 90% in the 1960s to what will be a minority within a decade or two. And that's because with relatively low fertility, aging population, high demand for labor, you inevitably draw in immigrants. And those immigrants very often come from poorer countries with a different culture, different religion possibly, and a different identification. So the mass demographic change we're seeing in the West and in the United States is the product of relatively low fertility for a very long time. We choose to go the path of having immigrants. Japan chooses the path of very limited immigration, which is giving rise to all sorts of issues in Japan. So my argument there is that if you don't have a high fertility rate, you really have to choose between mass immigration and ethnic change on the one hand, or real economic and fiscal problems on the other. So the last two numbers that I look at, which aren't strictly demographic in the book, are the extraordinary rise of education. So we can talk about quantities of people, but also their quality. And you get extraordinary transitions within a couple of generations. So I give the example of Bangladesh, where the vast majority of adults were illiterate when the country got independence from Pakistan in the 70s. Today, the only literate people left in Bangladesh are the very old, small, a relatively small number of old people. So we've gone to a mass literate society. In China, we've gone from a population which had no university education to one where half the cohort, like in Britain, is university educated. So that transforms a population the same way that urbanization does. And then finally, I looked at the rise of food production, which has been extraordinary. The great Malthusian constraint on population, when the world population was about 1 billion in 1800, was the production of food. If there had been no wars or famines, had been no wars or diseases, then the world wouldn't have been able to feed all these people. And we've had a number of waves of food revolution since then. The settling of the prairies, the railroads, and the steamships able to send mass amounts of food back to Europe took the lid effectively off the constraint on population in much of Europe. We had the Haber-Bosch process, which was developed around shortly after 1900. According to many thinkers, half the world relies on that today to be able to eat, the fixing of nitrates in the soil. And then we had the Green Revolution in the 60s. We've continued to have extraordinary innovation, which has meant that the world can very comfortably feed all its population today. Doesn't mean it always does, but we have the capacity. Global food production and productivity goes up and up and up. And actually the tendency to have children goes down and down and down. So whereas Malthus thought we would endlessly have huge population pressure against a limited capacity to feed the world, the opposite has become the case. So that's broadly a look at the world. That's my third book, Tomorrow's People. That's broadly a look at the world today according to the demographic transition and the forces which are at work.
So there's lots to take in there. Going back to education, and you talked about how that's affected. One of the things I was thinking is not in terms of how well people are being educated, but the fact, especially at university level, more people are being educated abroad and then bringing those skills. Well, technically, should be bringing those skills back. However, regarding the immigration arguments, and I think again, I saw this in interviews made. I think you compared it with Ghana, where you said that again, they've been educated, but then educated like with doctors and lawyers, but then they're leaving to go to Western society. Is that happening in a lot of like Western countries where they're taking a lot of like people, like educated people from certain continents into theirs, and how's it affecting those people, that brain drain, so to speak?
Well, I've made these comments really in the context of people who criticized my proclamation of a need for more children. And they've said, I mean, there was a review of my last book in the Times by David Aronovich, for example, and quite a generous review. I've got no problem with people taking issue with me as long as I'm allowed to answer back. And his view was, why is Morland going on about the need to have more children? We can just rely on immigration. What's the problem? And there are a number of problems. The first is, I think it's perfectly legitimate for people in countries to feel that they wish their ethnic group to remain the predominant group. That is true in Japan, it's true in Korea, it's true in Tunisia. There are lots of non-European countries facing the same issues of relatively low fertility and potentially high immigration. So I don't think there's any problem with people saying immigration has a role, immigrants are welcomed, and people are integrated and welcomed in the country. But that's not to say that having a relatively stable majority population is something you can't advocate. I don't have a problem with that. But the second thing is that where we are short of people, we assume that other countries will provide us with those people. Now, in Britain, we've had generations of Irish immigration, where Ireland's had a very high fertility rate and been a very poor country, and we've assumed that would just come. And now, in the more recent decades, we've had the same from Poland. But both Ireland and Poland have made terrific economic progress, so the economic motive's not there anymore to the same extent. and secondly, they've got much lower fertility rates than they used to have. So if you look at the number of 20-something Poles willing to come, and it's usually the people in their 20s or early 30s who are prepared to make the journey, there are just fewer of them in Poland. So we can't rely on European immigration forever. And in a place like Ghana, Ghana is a good example. It is said, and I think the data is questionable, but it is said that we have more Ghanaian health workers in Britain than in Ghana. Now, Ghana is a poor country. It's actually done, among African countries, done reasonably well over recent decades. But nevertheless, for a Ghanaian parent to have the child, bring the child up, for the country to educate it all the way up to being a doctor or a nurse, which is a big investment. And then Britain to say, we'll take that person, thank you very much, because we haven't had our own children. I think it does impoverish countries, and it denudes them of the resources, human resources they need. Of course, there are remittances, so that person may well send money back home. But a remittance economy is not the kind of economy you really want to build. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have immigrants, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have healthcare workers possibly from Ghana. But I do think there are limitations, and I think we should think very carefully before we assume that because we're busy and important, we're not going to have children, and we can just rely on someone somewhere else to have them, and then we can ship them in as we require with no concern or consideration as to the burden that puts on developing economies, which have often sunk a lot of very limited capital into educating these people so that we can then swipe them when we fancy.
One thing you discussed, and I'm going to go back to immigration later, but one thing you discussed was war and how if it wasn't without war, obviously, especially in 1800s, you wouldn't be able to feed these people and so on and so forth. But I was thinking we've had wars recently, not to the scale of like a World War II, but we've had wars. So isn't the nature of how we fight war now a big factor? Whereas before you used to have basically men going to countries and fight. That still happens, but now you've got the technology where you can be from another city, another country and fight and so on and so forth. And also, how does this population decline affect a country's defense?
Well, I think there are a lot, the interface between war and demography is quite a complicated one and has many facets. So one facet was Malthus saying humans have the planet has a limited capacity and people will breed up to that capacity and then live miserably at the edge of it. Now, the constraint will be food, but Malthus acknowledged that there were at least two other things that might keep the population down. One was pandemics, and we know that classically in Europe in the Black Death in the Middle Ages, the population was massively knocked back, and then sort of in Malthusian terms, it was below what the world could produce, and people actually had better lives in subsequent generations as the population grew back. So that's one aspect of war and demography. Another aspect of war and demography, something I argued in my second book, The Human Tide, is that if you have more or less a level playing field in technology, then numbers will count a lot. And a good example of that was the First World War in the West, the Western Front, where two armies or two sides, as it were, ground against each other with very similar technologies. And in that case, it was numbers that counted. So in that case, Britain and France combined had an advantage over Germany. Obviously, there were other factors, the Russia on the Eastern Front and so on, where technology was significantly lower, but the population was larger. So I argued that at least a population is at least a major factor in determining the outcomes of war. And then the third sort of aspect of war and population that I've talked about is something I've already made mention of, which is that generally it's young societies that go to war. And something that's interesting about Russia and Ukraine is that's something of an exception. But of course, we in Europe focus on that war a lot. But if you actually had a global view of conflict, you'd see that most conflicts happen in relatively young countries, which very often means Africa, and that where you get populations that have aged, like in Catalonia, like in Northern Ireland, like in Southeast Asia, you actually see a waning of conflict. It's not an absolute rule, but it is a factor. So that on the whole, where we see the worst kinds, the bloodiest kind of conflict, it's where populations are very young, in places like Sudan, in places like the Democratic Republic of Congo. aging populations are generally more peaceful. There are disadvantages of aging, but one of the advantages is that people are more peaceful.
Okay. Going back to the immigration point you made, you said about Japan, they don't have as immigration policy like the UK or some other European countries. So in regards to their fertility rate, what are they doing to basically boost their fertility?
Well, first of all, Japan is now having some immigration. I understand mostly from Asia, but it's still, if you look at the share of the Japanese population that's immigrant, it's still very low. So what the Japanese government would like to do would be to boost its fertility rate. And there have been declarations by Japanese politicians over a long period of time trying to encourage people to raise their fertility rate and have more children. So far, it's been fairly ineffective. I mean, Japan does not have the lowest fertility rate by far in the world, or even in East Asia. Compare Japan, I think it's something like 1.25 children per woman, which is pretty dire, but it's a lot higher than Korea at 0.7 or 0.8. So Japan has got a problem. Japan's got a particular problem because it's been low for a long time. Their fertility rate went below replacement level, perhaps a little earlier than ours, maybe late 60s, a little earlier in the 70s than ours, but it's only a question of a few years. But in that period, Britain's had a fertility rate of 1.8, 1.9, and Japan's been down to 1.3, 1.4. So they've had it for a long time. They've had it very low. So what does that mean? First of all, the Japanese government's got all these responsibilities for elderly people and a lack of taxpayers. And then that means that it's had to borrow money. It's had a stagnant economy since the workforce went into decline in the late 80s. When I was a kid, and even in my early 20s, we were told Japan's the future, what an amazing country, highly organized. And indeed, I haven't been to Japan, I've been to Korea, but my friends and family have been there, tell me what an extraordinary place it is, and what an incredibly efficient place it is, and what a strong and unified culture they have. But nevertheless, the economy has been in decline for a long time because every year there are fewer people in the workforce. Every year there are more elderly people the government has to take some kind of care of. Japan has the advantage that it started with a very small state. The government was a pretty small player, the welfare state pretty undeveloped back in the 80s. So it started from a low base in terms of government debt and so on. But they've racked it up a pace. And the Japanese Prime Minister is talking about civilizational collapse. You've got villages that are being abandoned. You've even got suburbs of the major cities, possibly not Tokyo. I think a lot of people are concentrating in Tokyo, but in a lot of cities, the population is declining. When you get a declining population in a village, the village baker shuts down maybe, or the school shuts. And before you know it, you've just got a few old people there. Then the last old people go, the buildings rot. I mean, you see places in Southeast Europe that are like this. And then eventually the small towns start to decline. There's no economic justification in keeping the roads going. You know, there are little towns in Bulgaria where they used to have or medium-sized towns, they used to have an aeroplane link, a plane link into the capital, and that's gone. Mm-hmm. And so from the outer limbs, I suppose, a society starts to rot or decay. We saw it in the US in Detroit. Now, the reason specifically Detroit had a declining population are different, specifically to do with the decline of the car industry. But what happens is you get people moving out, you get a declining population, you get properties abandoned, property values fall through the floor, whole streets are abandoned, and the municipality maybe goes bust. It's very difficult managing just about everything from a school to a business to a charity when you've got a declining population. Our economics, our politics, and our society are all kind of based without anyone really thinking it through on the assumption that the population will grow steadily, or at least it won't decline. Once it starts aging and declining, it becomes quite difficult to manage financially and in terms of labor shortages.
Yeah, and you alluded to this in your answer just then, but in terms of the housing market, because we're always told, oh, we need to build more houses because people are struggling. But then I'm thinking, if you've got this democratic decline, then you're going to build more houses, but no one's going to be able to live in them. So how is that So what's happening with regards to the housing market and
Well,
demographic
somewhere
decline?
like Japan, where immigration is very limited, the housing market, well, housing was very, very expensive in Japan 40 years ago, and it's come down in value. There are a lot of properties in Japan now that people inherit that they choose not to take possession of, like some legal system in Japan. I don't know exactly how it works, but essentially, I suppose you can choose not to take the property and not become responsible for the taxes on it. And that's because there aren't that many people in Japan, and there are fewer every year. So the demand for property is going down, and places get abandoned and prices go down and so on. Britain's slightly different because we've had mass immigration, and that has kept the population growth going. But of course, the problem in Britain is that we have had mass immigration, we have not built, and therefore we have a terrible shortage of accommodation. Accommodation is therefore very expensive, and young people can't afford to set up home, and therefore they don't marry, they don't have families or children, whether or not they marry, they can't afford it. And so, in order to fix that problem, we'd have to build houses, have young families, and get children who will work in 20 or 25 years. And it's much easier for politicians to just have immigration instead, where the immigrants come in immediately. But that doesn't resolve the fundamental problem. You put more and more people into the country, you refuse to build more houses, and the houses get more expensive. People don't form families, you're short of labour, you pile in more immigrants. And you often pile immigrants into places and areas where the locals, or at least conditions the locals wouldn't like to go. I'm sure there's a lot of geography in London that would be great for people to live in who are working there, but actually they're quite bad council housing, which we've crammed immigrants into who often don't work in the city or the West End. So I think every country's got its own issues, every region's got its own issues. In the long term, if you don't have immigration, as in Japan, and you don't have a viable population fertility rate, property will lose value and go into some kind of rack and ruin. But every country and region is different.
Again, we discussed immigration, but what about migration? Are there younger people now, or even young? I mean, I'm in my 40s. People now thinking, you know what, we're not liking how this is going. Like I said, immigration, whatnot. We're moving to other countries, other Western countries, or even other countries outside of Western sphere, where people think, actually, I could make a living here. And if so, how is it affecting countries at both ends?
Well, if you're talking about Britain specifically, Britain was a country of very, very low immigration and very, very high emigration for a large part of its history. At least if you take the British Isles as a whole, I know people have come from Scotland and Ireland and accept Wales into England because that's where the economic growth has been. But if you look at the British Isles as a single unit, since the Norman Conquest, or even since the Anglo-Saxons, there was very little immigration inward. And then in the early 19th century, you had this big population boom that we talked about because of falling mortality rates. And that gave rise to an enormous emigration. We take it for granted now, but it must have seemed weird at the time that English-speaking communities were forming in San Francisco and Adelaide, in the 19th century. It would have seemed bizarre 100 years earlier. But with a big population growth, a big emigration, people moved out. Now, after the war, so there was a relatively big Jewish immigration into Britain at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. But still, we're talking about tens of thousands, perhaps 100,000 people over a long period of time. We weren't talking about 1 million a year. I mean, it's a completely different scale. So really, up until the Second World War, there was very little immigration into this country. But there had been big emigration, and that had been required given the high birth rates. That had been people, Australia, the United States to an extent, although others went there as well, Canada and so on, the peopling of the colonies effectively. And then after the Second World War, you continued to have immigration. You started to have immigration from the West Indies, from sub-Saharan, from Kenya, from the Asians in Kenya, not other sub-Saharans at that point, and from South Asia. But even until the late 90s, more people left Britain than came. So we had a long decades of net emigration, and people continue to go to places like Australia, and they still do, and they always will. So we've always had a to and a fro. We've always had people leaving. Actually, we have the big emigration relative to the size of the population was in the 19th century, but people continue to leave. But what's changed is that we have this mass immigration of about 1 million people gross a year, and that's completely unprecedented in British history, really.
Yeah. What is, I know you mentioned this word before, what is the trilemma and how
So
is
the
that?
trilemma is the idea that you have a choice as a country. You can have ethnic continuity and avoid mass immigration if that's what you want. You can have small families and persistently low fertility rates. And you can have a buoyant economy. My argument is you can have two or but not all three of those. So you can go the Japanese route and say we don't want to have big families, we don't want immigration. And then you have an ever worsening dependency ratio, more and more pensioners, a shrinking workforce, and a lot of economic problems. Or you can go the British route and say we would like to keep the economy great moving forward, but we don't want to have very large families. And the only way you can do that is the kind of mass immigration that Britain has. Now, that doesn't mean that we've always chosen our migrants in a very strategic way. We might have focused more on working migrants rather than dependents of university students. So it's not a blanket okay to immigration. It's just saying that if you're not going to have large families, reasonably large families, at least a sort of 2 to 3 on average, and if you don't want to suffer labour shortages, immigration is the only stocking filler effectively. And then the third option, the only country really developed, advanced country that's chosen this option is Israel, where the fertility rate is 3, where effectively they've chosen to give up the independence and the sort of carefree lifestyle that goes with not having children. But they don't need mass immigration. They've had immigration, but now their migration, inward migration, is lower than OECD average, and they've had a very dynamic economy. So you can get 2 of the 3. You can't get all 3. You have a trade-off. And actually, I work with a economist called Philip Pilkington to say, well, what does the maths look like? What do the numbers actually look like? That's a nice theory. But if, for example, we said in Britain, let's stop migration tomorrow, but we didn't increase our fertility rate, how bad would the dependency ratio get? Or if we said, actually, we want to keep our dependency ratio, the balance of post those too old to work and those working, we want to hold that in rough equilibrium, keep it going, but not have any more children, then how big an immigration do we need? And if we don't want a majority of the country to be first generation immigrants, which is the way that we'd be heading under different scenarios, and we want to keep a reasonable dependency ratio, then how much does our fertility rate have to go up? So we actually quantified that. And that's a paper that's publicly available if anyone's interested. They just put Morland and Pilkington into the into a Google search. It's also, I've got a website where you can find it. It was published by ARC, which was a conference that was held last year. So, and we're now working on another paper, which I hope Policy Exchange will publish in the next few months, which looks at the trade-off between having a Thatcherite small state with low taxes and sound finance on the one hand, and having small families on the other. And the argument is that if you end up with the kind of demography we've been talking about after decades of low fertility rates and aging, then is it possible to have a reasonably small state in the Thatcherite model, or actually are these two things in contradiction?
That sounds interesting. I'm just trying to get my brain thinking what reasons there would be for both. Because I imagine with Thatcher, if we wanted a small state, would that be possible? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd have to look at it.
Well, I don't think it would be unless you actually abolished the welfare state. So unless you abolished free healthcare, you abolished the NHS, and you pretty much abolished pensions. So anything like the kind of welfare state we now expect is dependent on having a reasonable dependency ratio, plenty of workers for everyone supported. And if you don't have that fertility rate, then you are going to cause huge pressures on the welfare state. I think we can see that in very concrete terms already. We spend more and more on the NHS in real terms, but the results seem to be more and more disappointing, to the extent that a lot of people feel, I can never get a doctor's appointment, I can't wait 6 months, and people are forced, if they've got the means, to go private, or they just have to wait in agony for hip replacements. Why is that when we're spending more and more on the health service? And the answer is we have an aging population, and you can quantify You can look at what an 80-year-old requires in terms of healthcare and what a 20-year-old requires in terms of healthcare. And you can do the calculation and see that the added pressure to the state. Whereas under the Thatcher years, although there was unemployment and that was a real problem, there were a lot of late baby boomers like me. I was born in 64, so I was a baby boomer. If you count 64 as the last year of the baby boom, I was a baby boomer by about 6 weeks, being born in the middle of November 64. So I went to university, which in my day was much less usual. A far smaller share of the population did. So a lot of my schoolmates were going into the workforce at 16 or 18. I went in at 21. So that was sort of mid-80s, early mid-80s. There was a big influx of workers. We didn't need mass immigration. We had a lot of young people. And because we'd had a baby boom, there were quite a lot of young working age people and a relatively small number of people of the older generation. And that meant that paying for their pensions and caring for them was much more feasible. And it all worked rather well. I mean, all credit to Margaret Thatcher. She did some amazing things. But it's not just North Sea oil that she had in her favor. She also had a demographic situation that worked for her. And we're now in a very, very different situation. So if people on the right, the sort of libertarian right, the Thatcherite right, want to have a smaller state eventually, I don't believe they can reach that except by ensuring that we have the births that we need, or indeed mass immigration, which, as I've said, for various reasons is probably not sustainable and perhaps not moral either, to rely on others to do our childbearing for us.
One country that seems to have, and correct me if I'm wrong, that seems to have turned things around is Hungary. And if so, how have they managed to do? What policies were put in place by Viktor Orban?
I think the jury's very out on Hungary. So for sure, the Hungarians have talked about increasing their fertility rate. They've made it a question of public policy, which we've never done in this country. As far as I know, we've never had a government that has ever said a word about the issue after 50 years of having below replacement fertility. So the first thing about Hungary is they've talked about it. The second thing is they have put a lot of resources into it and started to reorganize their welfare state and their taxation system around supporting families rather than supporting individuals. Now, what have the results been? The results have been that the fertility rate, the average, put it very, very roughly, Hungary's gone from about 1.25 children per woman to about 1.6. So that's a good progress. It's not clear that it's going to go any higher than that. There's a technical reason that may have happened, which is to do with what's called the tempo effect, is that it was never really as low as 1.25, but people were delaying having children because countries go through a period when women started their families in their early 20s and they move it to them early or mid 30s. And in that time, the fertility rate is depressed somewhat artificially. And it's not clear that Hungary's done any better with all its policies than surrounding countries, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Romania. But what is interesting in Hungary is that with all these various incentives that they put in place to have children, like loans for houses that then get written off if you have, I think, 3 children, and maybe it's on a sliding scale. With those things, there seemed to have been an uptick in marriages, a decline in divorces, and maybe in Hungary, with the socially conservative policies and the pronatal policies, we're starting to see the pieces put in place which could lead to a significant demographic revival, or at least at least locking in the benefits of a higher fertility rate. So 1.6 is not good, but it's an awful lot better than 1.25. And it means that the problems they'll encounter will be much more gradual. The Hungarian government ambitiously wants to take its fertility rate up to above 2. It's spending a lot of money on it. It's trying to have a lot of cultural influence. And I wish it well. Whatever else one may think of Hungary, I congratulate them for recognizing the issue. And the only way we'll get our fertility rates up is through a lot of experimentation, different countries trying different things, some countries imitating what other countries have done. Some places it will work, some places it won't. Unfortunately, it's not a very simple matter. Every society, every culture has different dynamics at work there. So the Hungarians have not invented the silver bullet to raise fertility rates, but they've certainly done some admirable things. They're working hard at it, and I think they may in the long run reap the benefits, whereas we in Britain have not even raised the issue. Now, I think a lot of people in Britain think it's a subject that shouldn't be discussed. A lot of people think it's, for some reason, far right. And I find that very confusing, because it used to be a policy of the Soviet Union. It was certainly a policy of Mao before he died, as China was pronatal, basically. And the one-child policy only came in after he died. Castro, we've got centrists like Macron in favor of it. So we're in this really weird position in Britain where if you talk about this subject, you're seen as far right. In the rest of the world, you've got governments of the left, centre and right all trying various things. Only in this country, well, not only in this country, but unusually in this country, we immediately say, oh, it's all about Hungary, it's all about far right, it's all about Orban. Well, whatever you think of Orban, Macron's also trying it, and various other communist countries have tried to raise the fertility rate. Ceausescu in Romania banned contraception. So I think there's a kind of taboo about it in Britain that we have to get over. If people want to say it's not a problem, immigration can resolve it, or technology can resolve it, that's fine. Let's have that conversation. But let's stop this babyish resort to, oh, it's far right. I mean, I wrote an article for the Sunday Times a couple of years ago arguing this case and saying we need to change the tax system, the benefit system. And I'm not complaining that I got a lot of invective, because I think that's fine. I'd rather write an article and get a reaction and get a debate going. But so many of the responses were, oh, he must be far right. This is far right. Just call something far right and shut the conversation down. I don't think human life should be seen as right, left, or centre. It's an issue we all need to face. And if we don't have enough children, there won't be enough young people in the economy to support it, and we're all going to suffer regardless of our political views or our ethnic background or our religious orientation. I think if a government were to say we want to raise the birth rate and we want some sorts of people to have a higher birth rate and not other sorts, that would be definitely open to criticism. But I'm not sure that any countries in the West have. I know actually Romania under the communists, and Russia actually under the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, they were trying to boost the birth rate, and they said, of course, all Soviet citizens are equal, but we'll roll out these pronatal policies in Russia first, and then we'll roll them out in the less white parts of the Soviet Union. So communists have certainly got a record for ethnically selective encouragement of birth rates. But I don't see Orban doing that. I don't see Macron doing that. And I'm certainly not advocating it in the UK. So I just think we have to get a little grown up about it. We also have to realize that low fertility is not a white European problem, as it might have been 30, 40 years ago. It's a global problem. So some parts of the world, as we've said, still have high fertility, but more and more countries have got low fertility. Jamaica, for example, has a very low fertility rate. And the Jamaicans should be worried about that. It's not a country rich enough to attract a large degree of immigration. It's going to age very rapidly. And this is not about white or black, European or American or African. This is becoming a human issue. We have many Asian countries that are worried about it. We have Tunisia, for example. The president of Tunisia has said he's worried about very large-scale immigration from sub-Saharan Africa, where fertility rates are high, and in Tunisia they're relatively low. So it's not for the white Europeans to go around the world saying we're good cosmopolitans, we believe that immigration is the solution, you shouldn't worry about ethnicity at all, and you have to be like us, dear Koreans or dear Jamaicans or dear Tunisians. So I think actually we need to get beyond the idea, sort of 30 or 40 years out of date, that this is just a white European problem. But of course, in Britain, a very multiracial society, any policies we put in place to encourage the fertility rate will be applied to everybody. And in fact, one of the things I noted from the last census is just about the only ethnic group that is declining in absolute terms is the Afro-Caribbean one. And why is that? Well, first of all, Afro-Caribbeans have a fairly low fertility rate. Secondly, there's very limited immigration from the Caribbean. Africa's a different story. And of course, there's a very high intermarriage rate. So a lot of the next generation identify as mixed race or whatever. But the idea that this is as I say, a white European issue is just or a far right issue. It's just unhistorical, and we need to get beyond it and have a grown-up human conversation.
Just quickly, one of your previous answers talked about South Korea. Was it, did you say 0.7 their fertility rate?
Yeah, more or less.
That seems, I mean, that seems low compared to most countries we've discussed today. Why is that? When did that
Well,
start?
it's interesting. I've got a bit on that. So I went to South Korea last year. I was invited to give a speech, and I traveled around the country a little bit. And I think why countries have low fertility and some lower than others is quite a complex issue. But in Korea, I think you see all the features of a society that will end up with a very low fertility rate. So first of all, it doesn't have what you might call an Abrahamic tradition. There's a recent rise of Protestantism in Korea, but there's no tradition of Catholicism or even a long tradition of Protestantism or Judaism or Islam. And those Abrahamic religions tend to associate with at least slower falling fertility. So Italy has very low fertility rate, but it acts as a brake. It tends to fall more slowly. It's in Buddhist and Hindu countries. So India now still at 2, but it's falling very fast. Thailand has a very low fertility rate. So Korea's got that non-Abrahamic religious tradition. It urbanized extremely rapidly. It's an unequal society for the sexes. And when you educate women well and to a very high degree, and then you don't give them opportunities in the workplace, it seems they choose to go on a birth strike, if you like. Or particularly if you don't allow them to combine motherhood with careers and work very hard on the sorts of policies that give rights for women in the workplace. If they're forced to choose one or the other, they'll choose their careers. It's a highly urban society, so very, very many people living in Seoul particularly. And then this is more anecdotal and difficult to measure, but it's a very competitive society. There's a kind of arms race on about getting your kids into the best universities. And if that becomes an extremely large focus of what you're about, then inevitably people will say, I'll have fewer children, maybe just one, and I'll focus all my resources, all the tutoring, for example, on that one child, which is maybe why the Chinese, I think to some extent, banned private tutoring, because they saw that was a reason why people would save their pennies and try and focus all their resources on one child. So when you take all those things together, Korea is a bit of a car crash in terms of fertility rate. And there was a time we thought after the demographic transition, fertility would stabilize at 2. And then we saw countries like Singapore go to 1. But we're now seeing sub 1, and it seems like there is really no floor on how low fertility rates will go. And if it takes 2 people to make 2/3 of a person, then we will see a huge drop. If every cohort will be 1/3 of the size of the last. So the cohort of the grandparents will be 9 times the size of the cohort of the grandchildren. And I just have no idea how a government or a business or any kind of institution can really operate where over the course of a generation, 2/3 of the population goes down by 2/3.
And again, something you touched on there, where you talk about Abrahamic religions, and this was the next point I was going to ask you. How have different religions affected population incline and decline? Have they always, or is it just a recent phenomenon?
The traditions of the Abrahamic religions, which I spoke about, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, are broadly pronatal. Now that's very, very broad. So there's an antenatal element in all of them, actually, to an extent. So the monastic tradition in Catholicism, the Judaism and Islam are more, relaxed on abortion, for example, and contraception than Catholicism is. So it's not a very simple picture. But broadly, those religions celebrate family. And where they exist, fertility rates have fallen more slowly. But of course, in advanced countries like Italy or the UK that have got a Christian tradition, it hasn't stopped fertility rates falling. But they've just fallen more slowly. Now, they haven't yet reached East Asian levels. I don't know whether they will or not. I suspect they will. I suspect we're in pretty post-religious societies today, but we'll see. But the lowest fertilities have come in East Asian countries. And it seems the work that's been done that Buddhism does not act in any way as a pronatalist factor. Then, of course, if you look within countries, it is undoubtedly the religious who are having larger families. If you look at America and you look at church attendance, or Spain or France, a lot of these countries, however you measure religiosity, any measure, like do you go to mass once a week or do you identify as religious, whatever it is, it will correlate with having larger families, definitely. And in Israel, where I think the census allows people to define themselves, or the National Bureau of Statistics allows them to define themselves according to 4 or 5 categories of religiosity in Judaism, the fertility rate is higher for each. The more religious, the more orthodox you go, the higher the fertility rate. So we know within societies that religious observance for Abrahamic religions is higher. There's some evidence that in Islamic societies, more religious people also have higher fertility rates. So, and then of course in the United States, you get religious elements like the Mormons used to have a very high fertility rate, not so high now. The Amish, the Hutterites, and the Haredi Jews, who all have a very high fertility rate. So it does seem religion plays an important part. As the world gets less religious, just as it gets more urban, the overall fertility rate is falling. So the challenge, I think, is it possible to have a secular society in the long term or even the medium term, which is able to reproduce itself?
Well, yeah, because again, I was going to ask you in terms of secular societies, it seems to be a bit more individualistic, so, or at least delaying having a family later on. So I imagine that could be a main factor as to why secular societies, their fertility rate is just dropping like a stone in
I
some
think
cases.
that's right. And the secular people within any society. So if we want a liberal, more or less secular society in which people are free to pursue their own religions, but very committed religious sects are quite small, the society we have today, it's not obvious that that's going to be sustainable.
Yeah. And finally, because we're almost at the end, I wanted to get your, and I know you've touched on it with other countries, but specifically the UK, what policies do you realistically think, not just obviously we're going to have election this year, what policies do you think that governments could implement that actually help the fertility rate in a realistic fashion?
Well, the first thing I argue strongly in my next book, which is coming out in July, which is No One Left, Why the World Needs More Children. At the end, I talk about government. I do think there needs to be a cultural shift, and we shouldn't always think government has all the answers. So government can nudge culture, that's for sure. But whether the government's nudging culture or spending money, what matters most is what people want. And people say they want to have 2 to 3 children, then they're not having it. But I think the sort of urgent priority for people. So I'd almost appeal over the head of government and say to people, it's all about what you want. And if people don't want children, then there's probably very little government can do. I think there are interventions government can make. I think it can reorient the tax and spend systems around families, like having tax breaks when people have more children, and maybe people without children pay a bit more. There are simple things they could do now. President Macron, for example, has said he's going to introduce fertility tests or checkups if you want them in your 20s, which I think is a good idea because people then will start thinking about it. The teaching in biology classes in school how your fertility trails off in your 30s, I think would be a good idea because I think people don't really realize that. So I think you can teach people about it, and the government can, to an extent, intervene. But ultimately, I do think that it's down to people. And if people are going to say, I'm too busy, I'm too important, or the world's on fire, or how can I bring a child into this world, or a child's just an emitter, or whatever it is, if people are going to have those points of view, I'm very happy to take them on and have a good argument. I hope they'll read my book and see an alternative point of view. But ultimately, if people don't want children, then we will wither away as a society.
Just quickly, because it just came up to me in terms of economics, because talk about having larger families and whatnot, but we don't have the traditional model of family now, mainly because of economics, where both parents have to work. I imagine, has that contributed to the decline, especially if you have, say, don't have like a system where you have babysitters that are really expensive, and I know from friends' experience as well. So has that had a major impact?
I suppose it has had an impact. I mean, what I argue in my book is we need to reinvent the world. We can't go back. We're not going back to a world where mum stays at home. And I wouldn't want that. I don't want it for my daughters, who I'm pleased to say have both got great educations, great careers, and had children. So we need to find ways to integrate a modern view of women in the workplace and with every aspiration for career, education and career that men have, how do we reconcile that with having the kind of fertility rates we need to survive as a society? No one's talking about, and I'm certainly no one I know is talking about pushing women back. In fact, it's counterfact. It's a sort of it's self-defeating. If I'm arguing we're lacking people for the workplace, pushing women back now so we'd have more children in 20 years' time is not going to work. And if women get a great education, of course they want a great career. And if they don't get the career opportunities, that's very frustrating. So we can help, and we can think of innovative and useful ways for helping women combine and men combine family and work. For example, the idea that men have got rights for paternity leave and can share the parental leave with the woman, that's great. I think the ability to work at home is better. You know, if you don't have to go into the office every day, and there are some days when you're working from home and you can do a drop off to a nursery or whatever, I think childcare should be cheaper, and the government is going to subsidise it a lot. But I think there's a limit to how much that effect that will will have. If you look at countries like Germany or Estonia, where childcare is very, very cheap, people are still not having large families. So I think it goes beyond these material conditions. Material conditions are very important, but actually we need a cultural revolution if we're going to survive as a nation and as a human species.
If people want to find your work, where can I go to?
They'll find me on X. If they put my name into any normal search engine, Paul Morland, that's Morland, they'll find my website. On my website, I have all my links to my books. I have most of my articles, most of my podcasts. So that's kind of repository. And if they want to get in touch, my email address is on the website. So you'll find a contact link, and I'm delighted to hear from anyone.
Well, Paul Morland, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really fascinating talking about this topic.
Thanks so much for your time. Bye-bye.
Take care.